A beautiful Shabbat afternoon to everybody. Grace and peace be upon you, and welcome to this week's study from the book of Romans. This week we're going to be looking at Romans chapters 12 and 13 under the subheading, A Spirit-Led Life. Now, we have 16 chapters in the book of Romans, and so I think we have maybe 2 more weeks to go through this book. And there is an exercise that I would love to do in our last teaching. And I am going to invite those of you who feel like you want to be part of this exercise to participate. So what we're going to do is we're going to share what we have learned as we have journeyed through this book of Romans. I would love for you to share how Romans has impacted your understanding of the Pauline epistles. What are some of the things that you were not so sure about before you entered into this study, but that became clearer to you as we looked at the study? And you could also maybe share some of the things that you would like for us to revisit in future teachings. So how we're going to do this is we're inviting you to drop us an email with your feedback on this journey, and at the end of the study, I'm going to read some of your feedback on the channel. I'm very excited about this exercise, and I'm looking forward to, hearing from some of you. So with that said, let us jump right into this week's discussion. As usual, we're going to go back to the previous chapter and read the last couple of verses over there for ease of flow, and then we will go into chapter 12. From verse 25 through to 32, we discussed these verses, and we're gonna go back over them this week. It says, I do not want you to be ignorant of this mystery, brothers and sisters, so that you may not be conceited. Israel has experienced a hardening in part until the full number of the Gentiles has come in, and in this way all Israel will be saved. As it is written, the deliverer will come from Zion. He will turn godlessness away from Jacob. And this is my covenant with them when I take away their sins. In our discussion last week, we looked at a couple of interpretations as to what is meant by when the full number of Gentiles has come in, and also what it means by all Israel will be saved. We won't go back into that this week. If you would like, you can go and check out our teaching last week to see some of the interpretations that came out at that time. However, this week, what I would like to draw your attention to is what we read in verse 26 and 27. It says, the deliverer will come from Zion. He will turn godlessness away from Jacob. And this is my covenant with them when I take away their sins. This is actually talking about Israel's national repentance that has been prophesied to take place at a time in the future when the Messiah returns. It is in scripture where God says that he will turn godlessness away from Jacob, and as part of the new covenant that he would make with the house of Israel and the house of Judah is that he would take away their sins and put a new spirit on the inside of them. And so Paul says this is a mystery because Israel at this time is experiencing a hardening in part, but it is temporary. And there is going to come a time when God will turn his attention to Israel. He will take away their sins, he will restore them, and he will put his spirit in them. Let's go to verse 28. It says, as far as the gospel is concerned, they are enemies for your sake. At this, your sake here is in reference to Gentiles. But as far as election is concerned, they are loved on account of the patriarchs. For God's gifts and his call are irrevocable, just as you, Gentiles, who were at one time disobedient to God, have now received mercy as a result of Israel's disobedience, so too they, meaning Israel, have now become disobedient in order that they too may now receive mercy as a result of God's mercy to you. For God has bound everyone over to disobedience so that he may have mercy on them all. I want to share with you something that the Ruach HaKodesh spoke to my heart last week as we were going through this study. And we were looking at verse 30. Just as you who were at one time disobedient to God have now received mercy as a result of their disobedience, so they too have now become disobedient, in order that they too may now receive mercy as a result of God's mercy to you. For God has bound everyone over to disobedience, so that he may have mercy on them all. And as we were listening and discussing this last week, the Ruach HaKodesh said this to me. He said, God chose humanity. And when he spoke those words, God took me all the way back to the Garden of Eden. You know, a lot of times we talk about Israel being chosen by God. And people who are Gentiles usually feel very, badly, and I'm using that term loosely, or they feel as if they are an afterthought. Chosenness does not mean superior, and chosenness is really not a reason for anyone to feel as if they can boast. Chosenness is usually God choosing someone, or in this case a nation, so that he can work through that vessel to do something greater, right? But as we were discussing last week, and God said he chose humanity, he took me all the way back to the Garden of Eden. Before there were Jews, before there was Israel, there was humanity. And when God created Adam and Hava and put them in the Garden of Eden, he gave Adam and Eve choices. He said, you can either choose me, or you can choose your independence of me. He said, there are two trees in the middle of the garden. Of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you should not eat from it. And so it was a choice that Adam and Hava had to make. They could choose self-determination, or they could choose to allow God to make choices for them. Adam and Hava chose self-determination. So from the very beginning, God gave man a choice, right? They could either choose themselves or they could choose God. Man rejected God. Man chose self-determination. And we know the outcome of that. But then even when man got a second opportunity to choose God, man didn't choose God. Because after the flood, God gave man the opportunity to choose him. Again, what did man do? Man chose self-determination. And this is where we read about the city of Babel. Man said, let's come together and let's build a tower that will reach up to the heavens and all of that stuff. That was an act of rebellion. Man was saying, we choose the right to self-determination. We reject God. Then after that, as we go through scripture, we see where God chose Abraham, through whom he would raise up a people for himself. Because the nations didn't want God. The rabbis and sages teach that before God gave the Torah to Israel, God gave the Torah to the nations. He said, here is an opportunity to learn about me, to know my ways, to walk in my ways. But the nations rejected God, so he turned his attention to Israel. He raised up a people for himself. Later on, the same people who God chose for himself would later reject him. Right? So what did God do? God said, okay, I'm going to go back into the nations and I'm going to allow the peoples of the nations another opportunity so that they can choose me. And when the peoples of the nations choose me, Israel is going to be jealous. But I still choose Israel. Why? Because through Israel, God would raise up not only a people for himself, but he would also bring forth a Messiah, a Redeemer, a Deliverer to the nations who would bring a blessing to the entire world. Now, with all of that said, let's go back to this verse here, or these verses that I drew your attention to, where the Ruach HaKodesh kind of just spoke to my heart last week. Paul says, just as you, Gentiles, were at one time disobedient to God, you have now received mercy as a result of Israel's disobedience. So they too have now become disobedient in order that they too may now receive mercy as a result of God's mercy to you. For God has bound everyone over to disobedience so that he may have mercy on all of them. He has bound everyone over to disobedience so that his mercy can be seen. Because at one point, both Gentiles and Jews rejected God and lived in their disobedience and so on. But what? God has always been patient. God has always been kind and loving and merciful. And all day long, he is pursuing people who reject him, who don't want him, who don't desire him. But still, he is still pursuing man in love. And Paul says all of this is as a result of the mercy of God. When you look at it, all of this, it's the wisdom and knowledge of God at work. And, God's ways are beyond searching out and so on and so forth. But it's all about his mercy. And God's mercy and his love and his patience is really supposed to lead all men to repentance. But this week, we are now in chapter 12, and Paul is going to show us how we should live in view of God's mercy to all of us. And this is where our discussion for this week begins. Let's take a look at chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. It says, therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. So Paul says, in view of God's mercy to both Jews and non-Jews, our response should be to offer our bodies as living sacrifices. This is the true and proper worship. This reminds me, first of all, of what Yeshua said to the woman at the well in the book of John. He said to her that there is going to come a time when true worship will not be a matter of location, but it will be a matter of the heart. It will be a matter of the heart. He says this is the kind of worshipers that God is seeking, those who will worship him in spirit and in truth. So the spirit-led life is all about worshiping God from the heart and worshiping God with everything in us. So it says, in view of God's mercy, offer your bodies as living sacrifice. And even though Paul says offer your bodies here, he really is talking about everything that we are, mind, body, and spirit, because we are triune. Basically, if you want to look at it in that way, we have a spirit man, we have a physical man, but we also have that immaterial part of us that is called the soul, right? So he says, offer your bodies as living sacrifice. Now let's talk a little bit about a living sacrifice, because this has meaning for both Jews and non-Jews. Remember that the Jewish people would offer their sacrifices unto God. They would go to the temple, wherever that temple was located. At one point, it was located in the Israelite territory in the north. And then after a while, the temple was in the south, in Jerusalem. And so as part of their worship, they had to present their various sacrifices unto God. Now they were not in the land anymore. They were in Rome. And so Paul was saying that you live your life now by offering yourself as sacrifices, right? Just the other day when we were studying the book of Romans, I shared with you that Paul was saying to his Jewish brothers and sisters I think it was in chapter 8 that their relationship with the Torah would change as believers in Messiah. Not that they would no longer keep Torah, but they would understand that Torah was more than just doing, but Torah was about living a spirit-led life. It was about living a life as a new creature, as a changed person, as a person who had experienced rebirth through the Messiah. So he was saying to his Jewish brothers and sisters, your true and proper worship now is about offering your bodies. It's about a matter of the heart. Now, to the Gentiles, remember that Gentiles were not bound to bring animal sacrifices to the temple, right? They could if they wanted to, if they chose to, but they were not bound by any law to do so. However, in light of God's mercy, the Gentile was now to present their bodies, everything that they are, as living sacrifices as well. So both Jews and non-Jews were required to, in light of God's mercy, present themselves and everything that they are as a living sacrifice unto God. And as we go down into the next couple of verses, we're going to see Paul elaborating on what that looks like. How is it that when you present everything that you are to God as a living sacrifice, what does that look like? How do you now live a spirit-led life in view of God's mercy? In verse 2, he says, do not conform to the pattern of this world. So, in view of God's mercy, as a living sacrifice, you would ensure that you do not conform to the pattern of this world, but you would become transformed by the renewing of the mind. You now have to have a different mindset, a renewed mindset, if you are going to live a spirit-led life. You cannot conform to the world anymore. You cannot live your life the way that you used to live your life, especially for those people who were coming in from the nations, right? They had to be transformed by the renewing of the mind. Remember also that Paul throughout the book talked about what it looks like to be raised to new life, right? You are now a new person raised to new life. So if you're a person raised to new life, then your mind would also have to be, as it were, renewed or raised to new life. He says, when your mind is renewed, you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. Now, Paul is about to get into the meat of the matter as to what a spirit-led life looks like. And what I want to do is I would love for us to go back to chapter 8, because in chapter 8, this is where we're introduced to what Paul calls life by the Spirit. So let us take a look at some of the verses over in chapter 8, and then we will come back and pick up our discussion in chapter 12 from verse 3. We're going to pick up in verse 5. It says, those who live according to the flesh have their minds set on what the flesh desires, but those who live in accordance with the Spirit have their minds set on what the Spirit desires. The mind governed by the flesh is death, but the mind governed by the Spirit is life and peace. So when we're talking about living a spirit-led life, we're looking at living a life of life and peace. It says the mind governed by the flesh is hostile to God. It does not submit to God's laws, nor can it do so. Those who are in the realm of the flesh cannot please God. You, however, are not in the realm of the flesh, but are in the realm of the Spirit, if indeed the Spirit of God lives in you. And if anyone does not have the Spirit of Messiah, they do not belong to Messiah. But if Messiah is in you, then even though your body is subject to death because of sin, the Spirit gives life because of righteousness. And if the Spirit of him who raised Yeshua from the dead is living in you, he who raised Messiah from the dead will also give life to your mortal bodies because of his Spirit who lives in you. Therefore, brothers and sisters, we have an obligation, but it is not to the flesh to live according to it. For if you live according to the flesh, you will die. But if by the Spirit you put to death the misdeeds of the body, you will live. Now, in the couple of chapters that we're going to be looking at, we're going to be looking at what it looks like when we put to death the misdeeds of the body and we begin to live by the Spirit. In verse 14, he says, because those who are led by the Spirit of God are the children of God. So let us look at how we should live as the children of God. Let's go back to chapter 12. We're going to read from verse 3 through to 8. It says, for by the grace given me, I say to every one of you, do not think of yourself more highly than you ought, but rather think of yourself with sober judgment, in accordance with the faith God has distributed to each of you. For just as each of us has one body with many members, and these members do not all have the same function, so in Messiah, we, though many, form one body, and each member belongs to all the others. We have different gifts according to the grace given to each of us. If your gift is prophesying, then prophesy in accordance with your faith. If it is serving, then serve. If it is teaching, then teach. If it is to encourage, then give encouragement. If it is giving, then give generously. If it is to lead, do it diligently. If it is to show mercy, do it cheerfully. So Paul says that we really should be humble in the body of Messiah. I think these verses is really talking about humility. You know, Jews, don't think of yourselves more highly than you ought to. Yes, God chose you for a particular task, but that does not mean that you are superior. And yes, Gentiles, you have been saved by the mercy of God, but that does not mean that you are superior. We are to look at ourselves as one body, and just as the human body has many members, and all of the members of the human body, all the members have different functions, but they still make up the body, and the body needs all of these different members. He says, so it is that in Messiah, we are many, but we form one body. We have different gifts and so on, but we're all making up one body. So there is no one that is superior to the other, because everybody has their own function. You know, God has a plan for Jews, but he also has a plan for Gentiles. And he's working out his plan for Gentiles through the Jews, and he's working out his plan for the Jews through the Gentiles, right? So everybody has a role to play, and everybody is important. And so this should lead us all to humility and to serve in the place that we have been called to serve, understanding that everything is by the grace of God. He says, if your gift is prophesying, then prophesy in accordance with your faith. If it is serving, then serve. If you've been called to teach, then teach. If you've been called to encourage, then give encouragement. If you've been called to give, then give generously. If you've been called to lead, do it diligently. And if you've been called to show mercy, do it cheerfully. Let's take a look at verse 9 all the way through to 21. Here we're going to read about love in action. It says, love must be sincere. Hate what is evil, cling to what is good. Be devoted to one another in love. Honor one another above yourselves. Neither be lacking in zeal, but keep your spiritual fervor serving the Lord. Be joyful in hope, patient in affliction, faithful in prayer. Share with the Lord's people who are in need. Practice hospitality. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Mourn with those who mourn. In other words, have empathy. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be proud, but be willing to associate with people of low position. Do not be conceited. Do not repay anyone evil for evil. Be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everyone. If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. Do not take revenge, my dear friends, but leave room for God's wrath, for it is written, "It is mine to avenge, I will repay," says the Lord. On the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. In doing this, you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Now, in these verses, Paul is talking about how people are to live in community, but not only in community, but also how to live at peace with people even outside of the community. So let's look at his recommendations for those within community. He says that we should be devoted to one another in love, honor one another above ourselves, keep our spiritual fervor in serving the Lord, be joyful in hope, be patient in affliction, and be faithful in prayer. I just want to talk about being patient in affliction. Remember here that the Jews had been afflicted because at first they were ousted from Rome. Remember, the Jews were kicked out of Rome under Claudius, and by this time a lot of them had started to come back, but then there were still people who were outside of Rome who had not returned even after his death. And Paul here is saying, be joyful in hope and be patient in affliction, whatever affliction is coming, whether it is that you're being oppressed by the Roman authorities, or by the Roman citizens, or by the non-Jews, in general. Be patient in affliction. It says here, be faithful in prayer. Share with the Lord's people who are in need, practice tzedakah and practice hospitality. Bless those who persecute you, bless and do not curse. And then he, talks about rejoicing with those who rejoice and mourning with those who mourn, and living in harmony with one another and not being conceited. And then he goes down to verse 17. He says, do not repay anyone evil for evil, whether it is somebody in the community of believers or somebody outside of the community of believers. He says, as far as it is possible, be at peace with everyone. Do not take revenge. Do not take revenge. Here we can easily see how people, especially the Jews, who would have been persecuted and oppressed and chased out of Rome, and even when they're coming back, they would have probably felt as if they were second-class citizens, and probably feel as if they want to take revenge, even in the community of faith. Because remember that when the Jews returned, the community of faith was now predominantly a Gentile community. And so they felt as if they were, less than in the community that they had started as Jews, right? And so here Paul says, no matter the situation and no matter, who may be doing you wrong, do not take revenge, but leave room for God's wrath, because God says, I will repay. He says, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. In doing this, you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. And the same is true too for the Gentiles, who probably were made to feel as if they were second-class citizens. Maybe they felt like at some point or the other the Jews dealt unfairly with them, and maybe they felt like, okay, at this time we can take revenge on the Jews, we can treat them badly as maybe they treated us badly in the past, or whatever the situation was. Paul says no. That's not how people who are led by the Spirit of God should live. We should live in unity and in harmony, understanding that both of us, meaning both Jews and Gentiles, are here by the mercy of God and by the grace of God. And since God has extended mercy to us, we should be willing to extend mercy to others. We're now in chapter 13. Paul continues his instructions on what it means to live a spirit-led life. He now turns his attention to the governing authorities, and he instructs the community of believers to submit to the governing authority. We're going to read from verse 1 through to verse 7. It says, "Let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. Consequently, whoever rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and those who do so will bring judgment on themselves." Let me just stop here to say, remember how the Romans treated the Jews. But here Paul is saying, regardless of how the authorities might have treated you in the past and how they're treating you right now, remember that it is God who has instituted authority. And so to rebel against authority is to rebel against God. And anyone who rebels against God in this way will bring judgment upon themselves. Let's go to verse 3. "For rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong. Do you want to be free from fear of the one in authority? Then do what is right, and you will be commended. For the one in authority is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for rulers do not bear the sword for no reason. They are God's servants, agents of wrath, to bring punishment on the wrongdoer." Let me stop here again. Do you remember why the Jewish people were expelled from the Roman Empire in the beginning? Because they were doing a lot of revolts, right? They were engaged in a lot of warfare with the rulers. And even back in the Holy Land, remember that the Jews were always at war with the Romans. In Yeshua's time also, we know about the Zealots. The Zealots were at war with Rome. They were always going to war with the Roman Empire to take back power from Rome, and so on and so forth. Paul says, no, those of you who belong to the Messiah, you're not supposed to engage in any kind of warfare like that. You do not fight against the authority, but you understand that the authority is there because God allows them to be there, and so you submit to the governing authority. Verse 5 says, "Therefore it is necessary to submit to the authorities, not only because of possible punishment, but also as a matter of conscience. This is also why you pay taxes, for the authorities are God's servants who give their full time to governing." So pay your taxes and make sure that the people who are in government are able to get their pay, because guess what? This is how they get their pay, because they are God's servants. And this is how it works, that they are paid for the work that they do, kind of like how God said that the tithes and offerings and so on, certain portions were to be given to the priests because of the work that they do. Verse 7 says, "Give to everyone who you owe them, or what you owe them. If you owe taxes, pay taxes. If revenue, then revenue. If respect, then respect. If honor, then honor." From verse 8 through to 10, it says, "Let no debt remain outstanding except the continuing debt to love one another, for whoever loves others has fulfilled the law. The commandments: you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and whatever other command there may be, are summed up in this one command: love your neighbor as yourself. Love does not harm a neighbor. Love does no harm to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfillment of the law. Paul says that love is the fulfillment of the law. It was just last week we were talking about what it means, the word telos, what it means. It can also mean culmination, but it can also mean goal or fulfillment. Yeshua himself made the point that the greatest command is to love the Lord your God with everything in you. And the second is just like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. And he says the entire law and the prophets hinge upon these two commandments because the Torah is all about love. Everything that we do is supposed to be about love of God and love of neighbor. And I remember us having this discussion at one time when I said, when the Torah tells us to love our neighbor as ourselves, a lot of people struggle with that because we believe that love is supposed to be a feeling, the feeling that you feel when you feel a feeling that you've never felt before. And you feel that love means that you should feel this warm, fuzzy feeling on the inside. And a lot of people struggle with that. I don't know how to love my neighbor. Well, here in the book of Romans, Paul tells us what it means to love your neighbor. He says, love does no harm to a neighbor. So if you love your neighbor, you will not steal from your neighbor. You will not murder your neighbor. You will not take your neighbor's wife or your neighbor's husband. You will not take your neighbor's whatever it is that belongs to your neighbor. You will not covet or want to take it away from them. You will not want to bring harm to another human being. And of course, if you love God, you're going to do what God says. So Paul says love is the fulfillment of the law. We're either being commanded to love God or to love our neighbor. So he says, when you live a spirit-led life, you are going to learn that you are to love others. And I also want to expand a little bit more here on the neighbor. To the Jews, the neighbor actually meant those within the community, another Jew. But as the Gentiles would start to come in, it would mean the people who were coming in who were not necessarily of Jewish origin or Israelite origin, but it would also include those people as well. When Yeshua came, Yeshua expounded on that to say that your neighbor is your fellow human being, right? So whether it is someone within the community of faith or someone outside of the community of faith, we have a responsibility to show the love of God, because that's what a spirit-led life is all about. A spirit-led life is not about what we, do in terms of this mechanical doing of the Torah, but it's about who we become, and it's about how we treat others, and it's about the kind of, respect that we have for our fellow human beings. It's about how we treat others and about the love that should motivate us. So we do not want to see harm come to anyone, whether that person is a believer or an unbeliever. Let's continue reading. In verse 11, it says, "And do this, understanding the present time. The hour has already come for you to wake up from your slumber, because our salvation is nearer now than when we first believed. The night is nearly over. The day is almost here." What does he mean, the night is nearly over? Meaning this world system is nearly over. Also remember the persecution. Remember all of the things that the believers in Messiah had experienced too, which would be likened to night, persecution, oppression, that kind of thing. He says the day is almost here. The day when we look forward to in hope that Messiah will come. He will restore all things. We will get a new resurrected body. We will experience the glorification. and all of the other things that Paul spoke about in the book of Romans. He says the night is nearly over and the day is almost here. And I just want to encourage someone too with these words. He says the hour has already come for you to wake up from your slumber, because our salvation is nearer now than when we first believed. Paul was saying to the believers back then, how many thousands of years ago, that their salvation was nearer now than when they first believed. How much more nearer is salvation for us, the final salvation for us, than it was for them at that time. So the night is nearly over and the day is almost here. Be encouraged. Somebody be encouraged by those words. It says, so let us put aside the deeds of darkness and put on the armor of light. Let us behave decently as in the daytime, not in carousing and drunkenness, not in sexual immorality and debauchery, not in dissension and jealousy. Rather, clothe yourself with the Lord Yeshua Messiah, and do not think about how to gratify the desires of the flesh. And this is how we live a spirit-led life, focusing on the things of the Spirit, allowing the Spirit to lead us, allowing us to live the life, the new life that we come to live, because we have now died to sin. Remember, Paul says those who have come to faith, we have died to sin. Through baptism, we symbolize that we have died to sin, that we have died in Messiah, and we are raised to new life. So because we have been raised to new life, we should live in a new way. And this new way includes a changed mind, a renewed mind, and by extension, renewed attitude and behavior towards not only those in the community of faith, but towards those outside of the community of faith and to those in authority. And so we live a life that is lived in love and led by the Spirit. And we do it because the day is near. Salvation is nearer now than when we first believed. In verse 14 it says, clothe yourself with Messiah Yeshua and do not think about how to gratify the desires of the flesh. And so this is how we bring chapters 12 and 13 to a close for this week. Next week when we come, we're going to be talking about the weak and the strong, and how Paul says we are to live a spirit-led life, looking at others, recognizing that there is diversity and we all live and walk out our spirituality in different ways, but how we really should extend the love that we have been called to live by in these areas. So next week's discussion, we're going to talk about the weak and the strong. These are the subtitles that we find in the scriptures, but we're going to drill down a little bit more into that and see what Paul is talking about here. So next week's discussion is going to be a continuation of the discussion that we're having this week. And I just want to touch on this a little bit more before we go. And it's the whole idea of diversity. God is a God of diversity. You've heard me say this all the time. So we don't all look the same way. We don't all walk out our faith in the same way. But what Paul is encouraging us to do here, even as we're talking about living a spirit-led life, is to understand that we are different people, and people are different based on backgrounds, based on worldview, based on upbringing, all of these different things. Also remember that Hashem reveals himself to different people in different ways. And so we don't all practice the same way. We don't all look the same way. We don't all walk out our faith in the same way. But at the end of the day, Paul says we all belong to one body, right? We all belong to one body. And if something is wrong with one part of the body, it's going to affect the whole body. So we have to learn about unity, even in diversity, because even within diversity, there can be there can be unity. And this is what we should strive to attain as we live a spirit-led life. So this is where we're going to bring this week's teaching to a close. I want to remind you, just in case you joined us late and didn't hear the invitation that was extended to everyone at the beginning of this teaching. When we get to the end of the book of Romans, Romans has 16 chapters. When we get to the end of the book of Romans, I would love to share with the community your feedback as to how you have been encouraged or what you have learned as you've gone through this book. So we want to invite those of you who feel led to drop us an email sharing with you how this book has helped you. Whether or not you have learned a new way to study the Bible, maybe you learned to see Paul in a new way and Paul's writings in a new way. If there was something that you learned that you did not know before, that kind of thing. If you want to participate in this exercise, drop us an email, and what we will do is when we come to the final teaching, I will read some of your emails and share your feedback with the community. This is another way that we can all learn from each other. So I want to encourage every person to prayerfully consider participating in this exercise. Drop us an email with your feedback on the study so that we can share with each other on the last week of the book of Romans. Also, in the meantime, you may want to think about the next book of the Bible that you would like to see us study together as a community, and you can also go right ahead and share that with us also. So, until we meet again, may you have a wonderful week ahead, and may Hashem continue to bless you and your household in peace. Shalom, shalom, and kol tov. Thank you so much for watching. Do remember to give this video a thumbs up, subscribe to our channel if you've not yet done so, and hit the notification bell so that you will be notified every time there is a new upload. Until we meet again, shalom, shalom, and kol tov.